I have a question for you, webcomic creator, and if you're not able to quickly answer it, your story is likely gonna have a hard time, let's just say. If you go to one of the webcomic publishing sites like Webtoons or Tapas, you'll see a wall of different comics, all made by different people, with different visions and passions, but let's just be honest here, your brain will just process all of that information as slop, even though there are some great stuff hiding in plain sight. It all just looks kind of bland. Come on, try it, go into webtoons.com and see what you can find. Tell me, how many of these titles are you actually interested in reading? How many of those are you saving to check out later? I'm gonna assume not too many, or at least not most of them. Again, it's not about the actual quality of these works. If they are slop or not, I don't know, but you gotta agree with me that most of them really don't look too interesting. They all just sort of melt into one another. It's either some royalty princess type beat or a dark edgy badass hero in the starting zone got reincarnated with the most useless ability, but is the most overpowered badass epic badass. If there's a masterpiece in there, and there likely is somewhere in the middle of all these works, I wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at them. And in my opinion, that's half the battle lost. When you sit down to do your work, writing, drawing, putting your soul into your project, I don't think you want that to be the reception your work has, right? Imagine spending hundreds of hours creating your passion project just for it to be discarded as slop in less than a second by the average viewer. That's gotta hurt, right? So what can you do in order to prevent your story from disappearing in the sea of content? How can people give your work a chance when there are so many others for them to consider? Let's talk about how you can make your stuff pop even without special art or a glowing reputation, instead of letting all your potential and hard work go to waste. The question I have for you is, what is your story about? Now that might seem like an obvious question, kind of a silly one, but really trying to understand what it means. What is your story about? What's the point of it? Why would someone read it? And be honest about it. Is your story there for people to feel fuzzy, cozy, cute emotions? Is it there for hype and adrenaline? Is it there for fear and intrigue? The big word of this video is identity. You need to understand just how important this is. You don't need good art, good paneling, or even good writing if you have identity. I mean, those things are good and they definitely help a lot, but if you have identity, that's a lot already. And what does that mean? Well, picture, let's say, Dora the Explorer. Now picture Doom Eternal. There's kind of a gap between the two IPs, isn't there? Dora is that toddler-friendly, language-learning, cutesy drawing cartoon for small children. And Doom Eternal is a heavy metal, gore-filled, brutal, adrenaline-filled bloodfest for teens and adults. The branding on both IPs is on point. Because whenever you see any kind of promotional material for either of them, even if you didn't know what they are about, now you do. And the reason identity is so important is exactly that. If someone asks their friend, "Yo, I like heavy metal and badass adrenaline rush gameplay," they'll end up recommending Doom. So at the end of the day, your comic doesn't need to be the best thing ever. So as long as it is something and manages to be that best representative of that something. Looking here at the action section of Webtoons, the website, I ask you, why would someone read Guy with Sword, the comic? Well, I don't know, I didn't read it, but if you ask me why would someone read Berserk, I would definitely tell them, because it's brutal, because it's artistic, it is tense and hype at the same time. I know the type of people who would love Berserk, and I know who to recommend it to. But Guy with Sword, maybe not so much. That's why when making your thumbnails, covers and promotional material, don't be afraid to indulge deeply in your comics themes and your own tastes, because you can't really make something everyone would enjoy. So focus on making the people who like your type of stuff really like it. Make it the go-to for your specific combination of aspects and tastes. You can picture a few IPs, for example, when I describe huge buff manly men punching each other real good, or dark edgy teen boy who is a badass, convoluted political drama with a lot of incest in it. For each of these, you can already picture some stories, right? And that's because they fulfill their purpose well, even when their purpose is simply to be a power fantasy for the reader to indulge in. Like this channel, for example, you're watching right now. As a commenter said a few videos ago, this is supposed to be like a lunch break channel, It's where you go for some bite-sized yet deep writing advice, all packaged in a neat, tasty short video, like a cup of espresso. You just and keep going. It's here for you to watch in between your 40-minute YouTube documentary video binges. So when it comes to the question, what is your story about? You should have your identity figured out so well that it will only take a few seconds to answer it. That's the concept of an elevator pitch. Do you know what it is? Picture this. You end up in an elevator with the biggest CEO of investments. He can really make your story famous if he wants to. It's gonna be worth it for him. So he asks, what is it about? And you have until the elevator reaches its floor to explain to him. So that's where the name elevator pitch comes from. It has to be a quick, concise, clear definition for people to quickly grasp what it is all about. And if you don't have one right now, it's time to get to work. I don't think you can leave it for later. If you don't have an elevator pitch from the start, it means your story doesn't have a clear direction. It's messy, and it's gonna get more messy when you add more moving parts to it. Step 1 of writing anything is defining exactly what it will feel like to read it, and who will like it. Don't procrastinate on that. Do it before anything else, and then you can build on top of it. You need to get those essential parts already done. It's supposed to be something like, oh, it's Game of Thrones but underwater, like Atlantis. Oh, it's Attack on Titan but with giant bugs. If you can describe your work like that, that's a good sign. But a lot of people I know wouldn't want that. They would see it as being compared to something else, as being inferior to it, as being unoriginal. But that's not it at all. Because if people are describing your work as a combination of other works, it just means that you have successfully conveyed your points and people were able to categorize it in their heads. It means you have a solid identity for your work. And as they get familiar with your stuff, it will carve out its own place in your fans' heads, until it becomes the thing they use to classify other works. Get it? It's a good sign, unless, of course, if the IPs they are comparing your work to have nothing to do with it. Like you're creating a Shonen battle manga with a motorbike gang and they compare it to Seinfeld, then yeah, you're cooked. Remember that, no matter how good you are at drawing, writing, paneling, whatever, no matter how good you are, there is some 10-year-old Asian kid who's better than you. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a black pill, but you will never actually be the very best in anything for long. But that doesn't matter, it doesn't change anything. The only thing it affects is your ego, so it's time to let that go. You don't have to be the best, you really don't, you just need to be recognizable if you want to make comics, and showcase what you stand for proudly, because then everyone who agrees with you will see it and rally behind you. If you really like cricket, for example, and make a webcomic which is obsessed with cricket, most people won't care about it, I know I wouldn't, but everyone who is at least a little interested in the sport will hear about it, and every cricket enthusiast will read it at some point. And that's a solid fan base, one that can sustain your work, financially speaking. Now, since we were talking about identity, let me introduce you to this concept I came up with. It's the artistic marketable spectrum, and it is very simple. Every work of fiction ever published fits somewhere in this spectrum. One side is more artistic, meaning it's obtuse, hard to get into, hard to understand, but very meaningful for the few people who manage to actually do it. And marketable on the other side, which is the opposite. It is the most accessible, lowest common denominator type of work, made for everyone to enjoy. None is objectively better. I know some people will say artistic is better, but these are actually equal. Making something truly marketable is an art of its own, and it should be respected as such. You would think that the extremes of this spectrum are the hardest to make, right? But it is actually the opposite. It is incredibly easy to make a completely artistic work. You just throw paint on the canvas as you feel it, and it will reflect your feelings, messages, and emotions. But it will be truly impossible for viewers to decipher it and be on the same page as you. And you could make the most bland, predictable piece of media ever done, just copying everything that worked. But again, no one will care. So the best works always sit somewhere in the middle. Sometimes more artistic, sometimes more marketable, but always on the spectrum. The hardest thing to pull off is something sitting perfectly in the middle. It's media like Evangelion, which sold ridiculous amounts of merchandise and became internationally recognizable, but is very confusing and artistic in nature at the same time. Berserk, for example, is more artistic, yet it has a lot of marketable aspects. Boku no Hero is very marketable, with colorful designs, themes, and enemy teams for you to insert yourself into, yet it holds some weight artistically. And the last part of figuring out your identity and the identity of your work is understanding where it sits on this spectrum. So, what is your story about? How can you sell me on your idea in just a few seconds? What is the vibe of it and the feelings I'm supposed to get by reading it? Answer these questions and you'll have a solid base that will guide everything else you're going to write. I have a course for writing webcomics, link is in the description, and keep writing, cause the best is yet to come.